Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Even today, the words retain their stirring power. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. With his first inaugural address, Franklin Delano Roosevelt rallied the spirits of a shaken nation and launched an administrative era that would transform the country. His ability to accomplish this grew directly from his personal gift for leadership and a sensitive appreciation of the needs of other people. Indeed, the 32nd President of the United States was so transformational a figure that both his immense personality and remarkable political record remain influential well into our time. How he did what he did and how he used experience to gain empathy rank among the most compelling and useful narratives in American political history. My guest is Johnathan Alter, author of The Defining Moment, F.D.R.'s 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. Johnathan, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George.
Thank you for being here. Let me hold up this handsome cover. It's a very evocative photograph of F.D.R. at his most Rooseveltian, if you will, on the cover, and an extraordinarily good read, Johnathan.
Thanks.
Ironically, though, one of the first things I think I encountered in this book was that in a life so celebrated for eloquence, for the many things he said so beautifully, the country may owe him a great debt for words he chose not to say. And I'm referring to an address he chose not to give to the American Legion, or to the country actually, but speaking to the American Legion, in March of 1933, an address in which he would have, had he chose to give it, advocated a more authoritarian view of the American presidency. What I learned from this book, Johnathan, is not only did he not give that address, but there may have been a welcoming response in the country for it.
Yeah, you know, the ironic thing is that the word dictator, which within a couple of years after 1933, because Hitler was just coming in to power, would have terrible connotations, to this day has terrible connotations, but in 1933 it actually was a positive word, and you had people like Walter Lippmann, who was the very powerful columnist of the time, urging Roosevelt on the eve of the inauguration, Franklin, you may have to assume dictatorial powers. A lot of editorials around the country said things like, wanted a dictator, and in the New York Daily News, the largest newspaper in the country, there was even a car that Studebaker made called the Dictator, which sold reasonably well. And so Roosevelt was weighing this kind of thing in the days before he took office, because the financial system of the United States had melted down entirely. And you know, when he announced a bank holiday shortly after he took office, most of the banks were already closed.
Exactly.
So then we went on a barter economy for a while. So his, you know, the question was, what would happen? Would capitalism and democracy sort of change profoundly? And what I found in buried in the archives at the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, was an address to the American Legion, a short radio address that was given by FDR on the day after he was sworn in on March 5th, 1933. And in those days, the inauguration was in March.
Right.
And as delivered, so the document that historians saw, it was nothing. It was just a kind of a restatement of his famous inaugural address. But I found an unused draft of the speech where he says to these American Legion members, who are mostly in their 30s, they're World War I veterans, he says essentially, you are at my personal command.
And I may have to call upon you.
I may have to call upon you. Now, he had no legal authority to press these men back into service to guard banks or whatever he wanted them to do. So it was kind of like creating a private army the way Mussolini, who was very popular in the United States at the time, had. And he decided not to do it. So for me, it's about sort of the road, partly the road not taken.
And for me, that's one of the first defining moments, that road not taken. And what I think, Johnathan, based on the book, is that he decided to make a very different bet that you wouldn't need dictatorial powers, although they were waxing in Europe. I mean, this was a
Right.
worldwide phenomenon. But that rather what you could call upon was the native resilience and hope of the American people. You could marshal that.
That's exactly
and
right.
that's what he would do. Is that essentially?
That's exactly right. He substituted his own leadership skills, his own powers of persuasion, for government fiat, government by dictate.
Yeah.
And he proved shortly thereafter that indeed his leadership skills were up to the task.
Absolutely.
Because just a few days later, when he gave his first fireside chat and urged people to take their money out from under the mattress and redeposit it in the banks as they reopened, the American people responded, and Congress responded. In his inaugural address, he actually threatened Congress. He said, if you don't respond, I may have to assume wartime powers. And actually, that was the biggest applause line in his inaugural address. Not the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
I suspect that one of the reasons, Jonathan, he was able to marshal that hope, to recognize the need for it, and to use his personal charisma to mobilize it, was that he had such a marked ability, and it's demonstrated throughout this book, to draw from his own personal experiences as a way of understanding the American public's needs. And I refer here specifically to something that is almost like a leitmotif in everything he did, and that's the need for security. Now, here's a man who's to the manor born, a very wealthy, very rich, a pedigreed family established and all that. But I got the sense, Jonathan, he took that sense of his own personal security as something that should be the birthright of every citizen. That would be what he would.
That's right, and
politics.
he actually said that it went all the way back to 1910 when he first ran for the state senate in New York State, and he, being to the manor born, as you said, he said he was really struck by all of these people that he met who didn't have that security. They didn't really know, in some cases, where their next meal was going to come from, and we weren't even in a depression at that point. And then after he got polio in 1921, his empathy for people who did not have financial security really deepened, because he'd travel around in that hand-rigged car around Georgia near Warm Springs, and he would talk to all kinds of different people who were very different from him, and he would learn about their insecurities.
He referred to them as his polios.
Yes. Not just the people who had polio, who like him had been dealt a difficult hand but didn't have the resources necessarily to deal with it, but even, poor white farmers, African Americans that he met in Georgia, living in a very, very segregated society at that time, but understanding that there really were other kinds of people who did not have a rich mother like he did.
Here's a quote from someone who knew him well at that time, just after the Campobello discovery of the polio and what everything that flowed from it. Quote, lying there, he seemed to get bigger by the day. In other words, his personality, which had been perhaps a bit brash in some instances, had gotten very much softer and much more sensitive to the mass of humanity.
There's no question about that, and Eleanor talked about that frequently, that he probably would not have been president, I don't think, if it weren't for the polio, because first of all, that gave him a connection to the people, that they sensed that, they knew that he had polio. It wasn't a secret. They didn't know he was in a wheelchair. They thought he had sort of overcome it, and so that was itself inspirational on almost a subconscious level for large numbers of people. If he's paralyzed and can walk, then we're economically paralyzed. Maybe we can stand up too. But it gave him a depth of understanding that allowed him a suppleness to respond to the Depression, rather than coming in the way so many other Democrats as well as Republicans took a much more orthodox view of what you do and what the government owes people when there's a time of trouble.
Was there a parallel intellectual evolution on his part? And I'm referring here to the governorship of New York. I'm thinking precisely the period between his assumption of that office and then the Commonwealth Address in San Francisco, and a sense that maybe encountering unemployment and the hardships of masses of his own people in his own state, he also grew in his intellectual understanding of what individuals had a right to expect of the government.
I think he did. He was not really an intellectual at heart, but he was interested in in ideas, and actually in the period when he was governor, one of the things that I learned that I don't think had come out before, because I learned it from the son of a guy named Ed Flynn, who was much more important actually than James Farley as a political advisor to Roosevelt. He had been the boss of the Bronx, and then he became Secretary of State of New York State, and he was a pretty devout Catholic, and he had conversations with Roosevelt that his son showed me, where they talked about Pope Leo's famous encyclical from the late 19th century, which basically said that every human being deserved a living wage. And these conversations, and then also the reports that Eleanor, his eyes and ears, gave him about suffering after 1929 around New York State. This started to deepen his understanding, but he did not come to it all at once. And some people thought that on some things, you know, he was actually even a little slow in some areas. He was very slow, for instance, on veterans' benefits posed to them, and he was slow on some direct relief. He was a flip-flopper during the 1932
and even
campaign.
on the famous FDIC, that really wasn't something he supported at all. He was
totally against it at first, and threatened to veto a bill in the first 100 days if it included deposit insurance. And you know, during the campaign, one of the things I found that was interesting was he wasn't brave at all in the kinds of things he said politically. He was extremely cautious. And described by Herbert Hoover as a chameleon on plaid. You know, he's always moving around for the League of Nations before he was against the League of Nations. He wasn't a wet on prohibition. He wasn't a dry on prohibition. He was a damp, which was the ultimate straddle. So he was a very political animal. But what people don't understand, and I think we're seeing some of this in our politics today, is that the really successful ones, the big ones, they don't have a pure line of principle that they drive all the way through their politics. They're back and forth, tacking, and then
like a good sailor to get to the goal.
Like a good sailor, then they eventually get to their goal.
Well, you know, and I think that's right on target, and I think it goes with that he was also a very astute, hard-headed politician. You mentioned Herbert Hoover. There was a lot of animosity between those men. Two things about the transition that deeply affected me as I read them in the book was, first of all, F.D.R., I think correctly, or at least the people around him correctly realized it wasn't the stock market failure so much as it was the ramshackle structure of our banks that had to be taken care of. And Hoover tried repeatedly to get him to make some kind of joint declaration prior to assuming the presidency on the bank crisis. F.D.R. just ignored that, avoided it completely, and it seemed to me that he almost didn't care if things got worse. He was not going to share any kind of credit or the stage even with Hoover on that issue.
Yeah, he felt that he didn't want to have responsibility for a plan without authority. He wasn't president yet. In fact, he wasn't even governor anymore. He left the governorship on January 1st, so he was a private citizen, and he felt that even though he was the president-elect, that he didn't want to get dragged into Hoover's failed policies. So he dodged Hoover. He pretended that he didn't get a letter from him. And then on the night before the inauguration, they're arguing until 1 o'clock in the morning. And then it's totally unprecedented, you know, and then having this silent ride down Pennsylvania Avenue, and except for just a few blocks from here when they looked at the new Commerce Department building, and Roosevelt said, "Lovely steel." Those are the only words they exchanged, and the last words they ever exchanged. And they had been good friends during World War I. And then, ironically, Roosevelt actually adopted most of Hoover's bank rescue plans when he got into office.
They had a categorization of banks in ABC categories for revival, resuscitation, and what could be done. One of the things I think the book brings out most powerfully is the first 100 days, a phrase which has entered our political lexicon, really was not as structured as every succeeding president has made it sound. It sounded like a pretty manic affair. As though
that's a good way to put it.
They got together the famous brain trust and said, basically, I don't know if they said it, but Roosevelt's approach was, let's just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. I mean, try everything. Is that right?
Yes, he believed in what he called in a speech written by a journalist the summer before, bold, persistent experimentation. Take one method and try it. If it fails, admit failure frankly, which is kind of a novel concept nowadays, right, George? And try something else.
Right.
But above all, try something. So he, you know, a couple times a week, he would be putting something in front of the Congress, and the structure of the first 100 days was very haphazard, improvisational. 15 different bills, but a lot of them were sort of busted plays. They weren't what was originally intended. And you know, not all of them were rubber stamped by the Congress. And actually, there was a wonderful line from Raymond Moley, who was his top aide at the time. He said to call the New Deal a plan would be like saying that a boy's bedroom that was full of broken baseball bats, you know, old chemistry sets, and dirty clothes had been put there by an interior decorator.
Yeah. It was much more an approach and a kind of a sense of experimental spirit. You know, in fact, I got from the book also that the things we attribute to it rightly came later. The SEC, Social Security, and of course the FDIC, which Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which he didn't favor. But wasn't it cutting government spending? I mean, that was the essential thematic key, if you will, to what they were able to accomplish in the first administration.
In the first 100 days. You know, I think it was more than that because, first of all, there were things that sort of teed up later big accomplishments. So while the Securities and Exchange Commission was created in 1934, the following year, in 1933, in the first 100 days, they had the Securities Act of 1933, which in his message to Congress, he said to the old idea of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. We had a new idea for all time. Let the seller beware. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of financial transparency that today is the foundation of so much of our economy. This idea that you had to disclose the condition of your company when you sold stock to the public. So that started in the first 100 days. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which was very dear to F.D.R's heart, and got 250,000 young men out working in the forests within 3 months, the largest and fastest mobilization in American history. That started in the first 100 days. And there were, you know, we could talk about a number of other things. Like there's a lot of talk today about foreclosures. Well, they had important housing legislation that provided federally insured loans so that people could stay in their homes. So there were many substantive things that did happen in that period.
It was almost like a moving spotlight, Jonathan. First, restore the banks, then transparency was given to the stock transactions, subsidies provided for agriculture, and mortgage protection for homes.
Yeah, the agriculture part of it I found very interesting, not in terms of the details, because Roosevelt himself didn't care about the details, but the way he went about addressing the problem. This was the beginning of farm subsidies.
Right.
The first time that the government had ever really subsidized crops. And there had been a lot of talk about it through the 20s, a lot of complicated details that Roosevelt didn't want to hassle with. And he said to all the different farm interests, the grain elevator people, the farmers, the folks who brought it to market, the people on the Hill. He said, get in a room in Washington and hammer out a bill that addresses this problem in some fashion, and I'll sign whatever you come up with, whatever you reach consensus on. Because for him, it was less about the details than showing what he called in his inaugural address, action and action now. He used that word over and over again. He wanted to say to the people, I am working the problem. And the details of how he's working the problem was less important than restoring people's hope that government could do something about their problems.
And this brings us right to the complement to all what you've just said, and that is, as he got his government to do that, the other ingredient, of course, is conveying that to the American people. The fireside chats, the communication. That, I think, is as much a part of his magic as all the rest of it.
Yeah, this was a huge change, I believe, in human history, the way I kind of constructed it, because for thousands of years, a leader would talk to his people like this, George, because the microphone hadn't been invented yet and you had to reach your voice to the back of the room. Well, even after the microphone was invented, most politicians still talk like this. Even today, some politicians talk like this. Roosevelt was the first one who understood, the first politician in the world, I would argue, who really understood what the microphone allowed him to do, to have a conversation with the American people and to not shout into the microphone. And so when he said, my friends,
right.
I want to speak to you for a few moments tonight about banking, I read all of these letters in the Roosevelt Library, and that essentially said the same thing. Dear Mr. President, I felt like you were in my living room with me. And this is a transforming experience in human history. It happened to coincide, luckily for Roosevelt, with the rise of radio. If he'd become president 10 years earlier, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But it teed up all of the communications world that we have today.
If the first rule of radio is you're communicating one person to one person, and he instinctively understood that. I mean, I remember asking my mother, I was around, but I was too young to really know what was going on. I said, give me one word for the effect of the fireside chats, and she said, spellbinding. It just got to you that way. Another thing about him, Johnathan, when he put those people in the rooms and he said, come up with this, come up with that, and when it worked, it seems to me, again from the book, that he was masterful at delegating authority while retaining control.
That's a really good way to put it. I mean, he always had different people working. Sometimes he'd assign the same task to two different people, and then have a kind of a bake-off. But he was always in control, even if he was a little bit like Ronald Reagan and not wanting to get too bogged down in the details. So when he's really interested in something like the Civilian Conservation Corps, then he would get down into the weeds. But most of the time, on most policy things, he would delegate. But if you weren't producing, there were consequences, and he wouldn't call you in and fire you. He'd just layer you. He'd create another agency, and then sometimes when he thought something had fulfilled its purpose, he would want to get rid of the agency. He wanted to even get rid of the Civilian Conservation Corps, in the mid-30s, and by that time it was so popular at the local level, including with Republicans, that he couldn't do it. But he didn't have any belief that these things he was creating should necessarily be permanent.
Right.
With some exceptions, like Social Security, which for him was the centerpiece of the New Deal.
And which owes a lot to Frances Perkins, I guess.
Yes, and she's a fascinating character who had known Roosevelt since 1910 and served with him for all 12 years of his presidency, and she had great insight into him. Better insight into him, I believe, than anybody else.
They weren't able to bite the bullet on health insurance, of course, as a part of that at that time, though, were they?
No, and in fact, and I think this is instructive for today, a lot of New Dealers thought that the original Social Security Act of 1935 was too conservative. It didn't cover enough people. It didn't cover farm workers, domestics, because there was a lot of opposition, particularly from Southern whites who didn't want blacks in the South getting Social Security. And so some liberals got kind of disgusted with F.D.R. that he wasn't pushing for health care. But he understood how much the system could accept, and he in that sense he was a brilliant politician, and it really only cleared committee by one vote. So he was right, in terms of how far you can push. And he realized that they could go back later and extend coverage. And he hoped eventually to have cradle-to-grave coverage, including health care, but wasn't able to accomplish it. Then Truman tried and failed, and they've been failing ever since.
How would you characterize his overall triumph, Johnathan? I mean, in everything that you've said and the book brings out, I get the sense of a triumph of hope, certainly. Victory on many levels. Perhaps most of all, a great psychological success in this country defining itself, and as a result of that, setting a paradigm for presidencies to follow that wasn't going to be overthrown or even resisted. Right.
There have been many attempts to repeal various parts of the New Deal, and almost all of them have failed because even if certain programs are no longer in existence, the basic idea was a redrawing of the American social contract and a sense that we were not all what in the 20s they called, rugged individualists, rugged entrepreneurs, and who could just fend for ourselves. That particularly in times of trouble, the society, as reflected through the government, owed us something. We owed the government something,
right.
As Kennedy said, but the government also had some responsibilities to us when we were hurting. And that was, we take it for granted now, but it was actually a new idea, and that had taken root more in Europe before the United States, but we really didn't have it until the New Deal just flowered. Because before that, if you were in trouble, it was kind of your own problem. You could have maybe some local help in your community, but there wasn't any national responsibility to address your problems. And to this day, we're still struggling with how much of a national responsibility there is. But no one
denies
nobody
there is one.
So after Katrina, for instance, there was a lot of argument. Did President Bush respond quickly enough? Was it inept? Was it more the governor's fault? All these arguments. Nobody said that it wasn't the responsibility of the government to come to the aid of people when they were drowning. And Roosevelt said that Americans should not be left to the winds of chance and the hurricanes of disaster. And so something like, say, having your retirement security dependent on the stock market, which was an idea that was recently attempted to be revived, he would be totally against that. Other changing the retirement age or other things around the edge, he didn't have an opinion on any of that. But the basic
principle had to be preserved.
The basic principle that you were owed something as an American, that was enduring.
Johnathan Alter, I want to thank you very much for this look at a remarkable presidency. It's a book I recommend without any caveat whatsoever. It's well worth the read. It's a wonderful lesson for our time. Thank you, Johnathan.
Thank you, George.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcnetworks.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Johnathan Alter, thank you.
Thank you.
It's a very busy.
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.